Hi, all. That was such a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Sinan, for leading that. And really excited now to transition to a panel discussion around misinformation. Obviously, falsehoods have been around forever, since as long as there was communication, but there's a new form of falsehoods or inaccurate statements that's often been termed fake news that's gained a lot of attention in recent years. And there's this emphasis on this kind of stuff that's presented as if it is real content and largely or often focused on spread on social media. And this started gaining attention in the US during the 2016 election. Then, during the COVID pandemic, in parallel to the actual pandemic, there was this infodemic of misinformation that's continuing today. Then during the 2020 election, we saw a new form of political misinformation around election fraud really take hold. And it's not just a problem in the US, it's a problem all around the world, probably in many places much larger than the US. And this emphasis on misinformation has led to a great deal of public concern, as well as research, both in tech companies and among academics, around trying to understand misinformation, understand where it comes from, why people believe it, what can be done to intervene on it. And in this panel, I'm extremely lucky to be joined by three guests to discuss a lot of these issues. We've got Renee DiResta from the Stanford Internet Observatory, Duncan Watts from the University of Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts State Senator Rebecca Rausch. So thank you so much to all of you for joining. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think that a lot of the goal of this conversation is for us to talk about misinformation on social media, how it works, and in particular, given that this is the Social Media Summit, to talk about what is the role that social media in particular plays relative to other forms of media in the spread of misinformation and falsehoods and other kinds of inaccuracies. So I thought maybe we could start with Duncan. I know you've done a lot of work on the extent to which Americans are exposed to misinformation through the channel of social media versus other channels. Maybe you want to start by discussing some of that?
Sure. Thank you, David. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. And that was indeed an inspiring finish to the previous session. I just want to clarify that what I'm about to say doesn't discount the concerns that Francis was bringing up. I think that it's entirely appropriate to worry about the content and influence and management of any company as large and powerful as Facebook. But what I do want to say is that I think the conversation that we've been having, since the end of the 2016 election, very much so in the mainstream media and also in the academic world, has been extremely focused on what you just said, that the prevalence of overt fake news on social media. And just to give you an indication of that, if you do a Google Scholar search for the term fake news in the title of an English language journal, you get several thousand results since the beginning of 2017, which is an order of magnitude greater than for example, searching for TV news or some other relevant comparison. So there has been indeed an explosion of interest, and it's been very much concerned with social media. And I just want to make 3 points about that. First, that if you look more broadly at how Americans consume information, it turns out first of all that the vast majority of what they look at is not news at all. Only about 14% of an average American's daily information diet could even sort of be broadly construed as being news related. Secondly, if you were focusing on news content specifically, it's overwhelmingly consumed on television. So about across the whole population, it's about 5 to 1 in terms of how much time people spend getting news from television versus online, not just social media, but anything online at all. And about half of Americans get approximately zero news online on a daily basis. So if you're concerned about what impact where people are getting news from, you really should be looking at television as well as online and specifically social media. And the percentage of actual fake news that we spend so much time talking about is less than 1% of regular news and less than 1/10 of 1% of overall content. So at least in terms of the average or typical American, the fraction of fake news in their media diet is extremely low. And so that's not to say that it can't be a problem, and I'll make one more comment about that. But I think that if we want to understand like what's going on in our society and why people believe the things that they believe, we need to look much more broadly than social media and even more broadly than online in general. So we need to look across all types of platforms and all types of content, because I think the second point I want to make is that when you see content that is completely false or made up or conspiracy theory or outright lying to people, that seems sort of normatively bad, and we want to do something about that. But it's also trivially easy to get people. Thanks for your comment, Francis. That's my third point. It's also trivially easy to mislead people without lying to them, right? So we have research on this as well. Just cherry picking data or framing things in a particular way or emphasizing one comment, one story over another, the sort of things that we see in the mainstream media all the time can easily lead people to incorrect and often wildly incorrect conclusions without saying anything that would fail a fact check. So I think when we emphasize fact checking as a device to separate true from not true information, and we focus so much of our attention on content that fails fact checks, we're ignoring a much larger body of potentially misleading content that is saying things that individually are true, right? Somebody actually said that thing, that statistic is actually correct, that number is not wrong. Lots of things are defensible as true from that narrow perspective, but they can nonetheless lead a reader to a misguided conclusion. So I think we need to look much more broadly than just outright fake news if we're going to understand the types of problems that we're concerned about. And finally, I'll return to Francis's point here that to the extent that we are, and I agree, we should be concerned about what's happening on social media, looking at the average or typical person is probably the wrong way to think about it. That in fact, it's the concentration of particular types of content among relatively small groups of people who often are coming because they want that content, right? It's not necessarily that the platform is driving people into a particular extreme position, but that the evidence that we have looking at YouTube, for example, there is a lot of user demand in this story, right? That people come if they're looking for, if they're being exposed to extreme content on YouTube, it's because they're looking for it, right? And they consume that content off of YouTube, and they search for it, and they arrive at YouTube from some other location online where they're consuming that kind of content, and then they can get served up that content sort of ad nauseum. So, so there are these relatively small, tiny percentages of the population who are sort of actively seeking out particular types of content, and social media provides affordances that potentially amplify that process. And so absolutely, that's something that we should be worried about because we know that small groups of people with extreme points of view and beliefs can indeed inflict disproportionate harm on society. So it's not to say that's not a problem, it's to say it's a different problem from, oh, we're all swimming in this sort of sea of misinformation, and there's some sort of large average effect that is being applied to society. So I think it's more just about being clear about like where the problems are, and thinking, broadly about where they could be. That is sort of the point of my argument. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be worried about the things that we're currently worried about. I'm saying that we should be placing them in a broader context, and focusing our concerns on the areas that are more plausibly problematic. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's extremely interesting, and I think it's a very important point. As someone who myself has now for 5 or 6 years been working a lot on misinformation with a particular focus on social media, I feel like these in the last couple of years there's been a bunch of work in this vein, that is sort of raising the question of how much should we be focusing on social media versus other platforms, or in what ways should we be talking about it. And I think that this is really important, and it's happening more in the academic discussion than it is in the public discussion. And my sense is this hasn't really been making it that far into the more general discussion about misinformation. And at least to me, it seems like one of the things that's really interesting and challenging about this idea of, okay, there is a lot of exposure to misinformation on social media, it's just only among a fairly small set of people who are getting this exposure, is like, it makes it harder to understand what the consequences of that exposure are, because if these are people that are probably already fairly radicalized to begin with, in some sense, maybe this is less about changing attitudes and more about activating people, or things like that. And then also, from trying to study it from an academic perspective, it's hard to get those people in our studies.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're studying, getting representative samples, that's maybe not actually super useful. And so it seems like this is maybe a thing. We're currently doing some studies where we're going and trying to specifically recruit people who in the wild are consuming this kind of content,
Right.
to get a better insight into essentially how much what we're learning with regular representative Americans generalizes to these kind of pockets.
Yep. Yeah, and just to pile on that, I think I couldn't agree more with Francis's final point, which is that that the solution here definitely requires more transparency from the platforms. That if you, especially if you want to study, sort of large concentrations on small numbers of people, that is extremely difficult to do from the kind of data that we have available. And potentially the only people who have access to that sort of information are people who work for inside the firewalls. And so I think that regardless of what you think the problem is, the solution is still we need to have a much more systematic way of an open and transparent way of studying what is happening in these walled gardens.
Totally. And I think, there's a lot of discussion about policy and what are the policy implications, what policies should be being proposed. And my sense of it is we are very far from knowing what policies should be proposed in terms of changing social media platform behavior, regulating it. But what we really need policy around is transparency and making data available, from breaking down the walls of the walled garden, so that people from the outside can learn more about what is going on. And from that, we can potentially learn what other kinds of regulations are needed. But until we have that information, we really don't know. So I think another element of this is that in terms of what happens on social media, that can matter in terms of the people who are directly exposed on social media, but it can also matter in terms of the sort of feedback loops between social media and more traditional media. And so Renee, I know you've done work on this, and some of the sort of narrative handoffs between social media and more traditional media sources. I think also political elites play an important role in that, where things get said on social media by random people, they get amplified by political elites, they wind up on mainstream media, then everybody hears about it, and so on. So would you like to talk about some of that work?
Sure, I'll try to tie it into what Duncan was saying also. So one of the interesting things that we see whenever we have visibility into social media. We hear these statistics that say that, under 10% of people are producing 80% of content. We see this real disproportionate dynamic in which very, very small numbers of people manage to achieve remarkable outsize reach. We can't necessarily say impact. That's not something that my team studies, but what we can say is reach, engagement, spread. And one of the things to kind of tie in also to this debate about fake news and misinformation, one of the terms that we use a lot at SIO is actually propaganda. I really feel that is just such an excellent term for describing this information, with the exhortation to share it, with the literal definition of the word means to propagate, the idea that information must be propagated. And social media is a phenomenal tool for this, particularly where small numbers of people can propagate and achieve very, very significant reach in a way that they couldn't in old broadcast media environments that were much more top down. So one of the interesting, I don't know that I necessarily call it a debate, but shifts that we see happening is that social media is a channel in a broader media environment. It is not separate and distinct. It must be considered, as Duncan alludes to, in the context of that broader media environment, in the context of how does a narrative move from the online space, particularly from a very small niche online space, to mass awareness where it's being discussed on, for example, Fox News or CNN. And so one of the interesting dynamics that we see happening is very, very kind of ordinary groups of people during the election who had been primed, who had been hearing actually on media that the election was going to be stolen. That was the frame that they were given. There will be fraud. Were then inclined to look for fraud. And when they saw something even vaguely, relatively mundane, a suitcase outside of a polling facility, they would snap a picture of it and they would tweet, "What is this suitcase doing outside of this polling facility?" And what you would see happen, and this happened over and over and over again, is you would see an incentivized, ideologically aligned influencer, someone with a very large following, who would pick up that claim and who would amplify it. And they would do it in a very rhetorically interesting way. They wouldn't stake their reputation on the claim. They would say something like "big if true," right? Which is a way of saying nothing at all while still boosting something. It creates innuendo. It creates a perception that something is happening. "Big if true, isn't this weird? Somebody should really look into this." And that's the kind of rhetoric that you see happening that pulls it from this observation from someone with a camera phone, who then takes it to somebody who has significant reach, who has either a high centrality position in a network, or who has a very large following on a Facebook page. That person amplifies it. You'll see then ideologically aligned hyperpartisan media will come in and will do the same thing. And they too will not, there's I forget the law in journalism, but there's something that says, if the headline is a question, the answer is no. Maybe somebody else can comment on what that is. But again, just asking questions. Is it true that, that this suitcase outside of a polling place was really them transporting ballots to another location? No, but that's how they're going to frame it. And then you see this process of narrative creation, of taking something that's a relatively mundane non-event and turning it in through this process of amplification. The influencer has an amplification network. The hyperpartisan media outlet has an amplification network, until it winds up discussed on the nightly news as "some people on the internet are saying." And it's a really remarkable process, because it's such a phenomenally distinct form of creating what is effectively propaganda. It is there's a political innuendo there. There's a political ideology. It's probably not a falsifiable claim. And so it's just this fascinating construction dynamic that we see happening with increasing frequency over the last few years.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think that, it's like a version of this that, I think what this emphasizes is the way that a lot of the thinking around like fake news and misinformation has evolved. Where I feel like during 2016, a lot of what the concern is about is what, essentially like random people creating false claims and then those things going viral. Like, I think it's sort of typified by the Macedonian teenager, right? Creates random stuff, goes viral, and like Pope endorses Donald Trump, millions of people see it, and at the very least, it makes people more likely to think that the Pope endorses Donald Trump. It's much harder. It's quite hard to assess the actual impacts of exposure to misinformation on things like attitudes or behaviors, but at the very least, there's a lot of evidence that exposure to false claims makes you more likely to believe them, even if they're really crazy, and even if at baseline you don't believe them. It just if it makes it ring true, essentially. Like, our brains use familiarity as a cue for accuracy. We've done a bunch of work demonstrating that. But I think that the 2020 election misinformation, with the example you're giving with the ballots, feels very different in the sense that it was sort of like a coordinated top-down misinformation campaign run largely by elites. And it wasn't like a one-off thing that went viral, but like, for months before the election, Trump, as you were saying, was repeatedly like saying there's going to be fraud, there's going to be fraud, there's going to be fraud. And then there's a lot of the amplification going on where like, your example of someone makes a claim, like say, hey, here's a suitcase, and then it gets amplified by an elite. Duncan, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, that was a fantastic example, Renee, and really interesting process. And, it's something that we would love to do more work on as well. And I think what it really illustrates is that, all of these questions are really referencing this sort of complex ecosystem in which you have lots of different types of actors, interacting through different types of media, right? So you have the mainstream media that's influencing many individual people, and then those people take some action on their own social media sites, and then they bubble up through influencers, which may also be political elites, right? Because there are a lot of them are present on social media as well. And then it funnels back to the mainstream media again, and the cycle continues. And I think that's exactly the right way to think about it. The problem is that our research, the way we structure our research, is very platform specific, right? So somebody has data about Twitter, or somebody has data about YouTube, or somebody has data about Facebook. And so the tendency is then to sort of treat that as if that's the universe, right? And so we go and we analyze our data and we find something that looks bad, and we say, oh, look, there's this terrible problem with Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, and like they should fix that, right? But if you did that, you might find that it doesn't have the consequence that you thought it was going to have, because actually there's this sort of larger system that these things are all part of, and you're not sort of looking at the whole process. And so I think, where I come down on that is that we really need, as a research community, to be thinking very seriously and arguing for the resources to construct data sets and research infrastructure that spans across multiple platforms, right? That we have to be able to sort of, in some sense, look at the whole in order to see where, if we're going to have any sense of where the right intervention points are going to be, right? Otherwise, we're going to be sort of just constantly generating these unanticipated consequences. And this comes up very specifically in the question of deplatforming, right? Where you say, oh, let's just sort of, take this person off of this platform, or take this whole platform down, right? As happened with Parler, right after the January 6th riots. And then, if you look at it, you say, oh, great, it went away. There's no more traffic there. But of course, the world has lots of other options, and there are other places that people can go. And if you look at those places, you might find that, in fact, everybody just reassembled somewhere else. And so maybe your intervention didn't have the effect that you thought it did. And so, I don't know if I don't know the answer, right? But I think we need better ways to answer those kinds of questions if we're going to sort of make a serious dent in these problems.
And speaking of interventions, I think another thing that is an implication of this viewing the problem as, that's one view of the misinformation problem, was large swaths of users on social media are getting exposed to lots of bad information, and we need that to stop. And that's sort of been the perspective that like a lot of my work has largely been coming from, like although it came up in the conversation between Sinan and Francis, of we show if you get people to like think about accuracy, if you've primed the concept of accuracy, that increases the quality of the news that regular people share, because most people don't want to share inaccurate information. They just forget to think about it while they're rolling around. And like, or you can use crowds to help identify bad information at scale and then put the brakes on it and it doesn't spread as quickly. And that's useful if what the goal is to reduce the average level of exposure. But if what you're thinking about is the chain is like random person does a thing that the elite sees, elite amplifies it, mainstream media picks it up, then everybody sees it, that's a completely different like mode, essentially, a completely different mechanism that needs different kinds of interventions. So I don't know. So I think this is really important to think about these sorts of dynamics. And obviously, in addition to the election stuff, another place where there's been a whole lot of misinformation is around COVID and COVID vaccines. And Senator Roush, I know you've been very active in the context of COVID vaccine policy and anti-vax misinformation. And would you like to speak a little bit to that and how you see that, that kind of misinformation operating in the space, things around evidence where the anti-vax misinfo is coming from and incentives around that?
Sure, happy to. Thank you so much, David, and it's a privilege to be with you and with fellow esteemed panelists. I am a state senator in Massachusetts. I've been a leading legislative voice on public health and immunization infrastructure, and that predates COVID, although certainly the work has become increasingly visible and increasingly important due to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this manifestation in social media and the spread of mis and disinformation is just incredibly harmful in so many ways. According to the Center for Countering Digital Hate, 147 of the leading anti-vax social media accounts gained over 10 million followers between 2019 and 2020, an increase of 25% over just 1 year. The additional growth took place, and this goes to the previous comment about studying multiple platforms simultaneously. The additional growth took place primarily on Instagram and YouTube, with vaccine refusers adding an additional 4.3 million followers on each platform. A number of anti-vax leaders seized the COVID pandemic as a historic opportunity to popularize anti-vaccine sentiment, including Robert Kennedy Jr., who stated at the 2020 National Vaccine Information Center conference that the public is finally hearing, and I'm quoting, all of the truths that we've been trying to broadcast for many, many years, and that those seeds are landing on very fertile ground. And that fertile ground is rooted in social media. Of course, none of the things that they are saying are actually true. And in fact, a study from just last year, 2021, out of UC San Diego found that due to the politicization, the polarization, and disinformation around the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccine hesitancy rose in the United States, not only around the COVID-19 vaccine, but also around the flu shot and other routine vaccinations that keep us all, not just as individuals, but as populations, safe through herd immunity. And perhaps even more concerningly, a group of only 12 anti-vax leaders that have been dubbed the Disinformation Dozen by that Center for Countering Digital Hate are responsible for 65%, nearly 2/3 of all vaccine opposition content on social media. And many of them profit personally off of vaccine hesitancy through selling their own dietary supplements and false cures, quote unquote, as alternatives to vaccines. And we see the ramifications of that quite significantly in groups of people who are small in number but large in volume.
Yeah, and it's interesting for those volume things, really the thing that you care about is exposure rather than total number of content. Like there's some things where it's like, oh, like bots are responsible for, some huge percentage of the bad content posted, but most of those bots don't have any followers. So like nobody really cares there. But it seems like in this case, it seems like a lot of these people are people that do actually have pretty large platforms. And so something that makes me think about is like, in analyses that like Duncan's group has done and that of the various other groups that have been trying to quantify the amount of misinformation have largely been focusing on, it's mostly been done at the level of links. So like in the URLs and what domains are the URLs linking out to. I wonder essentially how much this is missing in some sense. And particularly, I feel like for a lot of the COVID misinfo that I've seen, it's more like somebody does a post that says, oh, you know, COVID vaccines are, you know, killing people or whatever. And it's not that they link out to like a supposed news article. They're just making false or misleading claims in posts. And so I wonder how much, essentially how much we're missing by doing this link-based approach, and also how different COVID is relative to politics. Particularly in the case that, or in context that like, we think about politics a lot and care about politics a lot, but you know, one of the sort of central truths from political science is most Americans don't care about politics at all and don't really pay any attention to politics. But I think everybody cares about their health, and COVID massively affected everyone's lives for at least some amount of time. So it is also possible that there was a much bigger scope there. And I don't actually know, I'm sure someone has done it. I don't know if any of you guys know about work sort of doing a similar like attempt to get at how much exposure to bad content people were related to COVID people were getting, and how concentrated versus distributed it is.
Yeah, I can maybe speak to that for 1 second. We put out a report. We did a project for about a year called the Virality Project, viralityproject.org. On the landing page is now the final report. One of the things that happens that we're trying to get better at quantifying, and so we weren't using links, by the way. We were looking a lot at CrowdTangle, actually, at Facebook, and at not only kind of keyword-based or URL-based detection of narratives, but also what is coming out of communities? What are interesting narratives that appear to be taking hold within communities? So you could define a community as a, you know, kind of people who produce similar content, influencers who produce similar content. We could aggregate a list. We could look at what vaccine-related topics emerge in those communities. There are some that are anti-vaccine communities that where their primary focus for years and years and years has been the vaccine conversation. Many of the people in the disinformation dozen are those figures, and so they have, you know, this has been their sole, you know, their sole focus has been ranting about vaccines of all varieties for years. But one of the things that's very interesting, we saw this kind of for the first time during pandemic as we were trying to quantify it, is that you'll see things that will emerge from there, but will largely stay confined to the community. So if you're only looking at engagement data, you're missing the fact that it's still largely confined to groups and pages focused on that topic. Some of those groups, you know, some of those communities are large, but again, it's a little bit more of like an echo chamber. They're talking about the same thing. They've been interested in that thing. They're highly activist, and that's where it tends to stay. But what you see with something like Plandemic, we looked at Judy Mikovits, we looked at her name and we looked at the word Plandemic as opposed to trying to trace a particular URL. And when you look at mentions, what you see happen as that video goes viral is it's one of the things that breaks out of the anti-vaccine community, and it makes it to the wellness community, and then it makes it to the QAnon groups, and then it makes it to mainstream MAGA. And you can follow these trails. You can see kind of like over time what groups is it in, what kinds of groups are the shares happening in. And what you start to see is it makes its way into what we classified as other. Which was like the dog club of Bridgeport or like the gardening club of Tampa, like these communities that don't talk about this stuff at all normally, and they're sharing it. And when you go and you look at those shares, what you see are people who are actually just trying to make sense of this thing. They don't have familiarity with anti-vaccine rhetoric. They don't have familiarity with VAERS. They don't have familiarity with all of these things that, you know, that this particular niche group of people who has tried to undermine confidence in vaccines for years have a familiarity and a vocabulary for. So when you see it make its way into these completely incongruous places where that is not the topic of conversation, if you read through the comments, you actually do see people just trying to make sense of, you know, of what they've just been shown. And it's a pretty interesting dynamic, again, to look at it off of Twitter, to look at it on Facebook, this dynamic of not only what are the engagements, but what specific types of communities is this narrative propagating through? And what we describe in the Virality Project report is that not all narratives are evenly distributed across all communities. This kind of alludes to what Duncan was saying in the beginning. there are certain narratives that are going to have a deeper emotional resonance with particular types of people in particular circumstances, whether that's a demographic identity or their parents, or they're very concerned about wellness and health. And so it's not, the misinformation is not uniform, and it's not received and propagated on uniformly. It's much more, what is the fit of the message, and then the activism of the community. And that's what we see really playing a pretty significant role, it seems, in the further propagation.
That's super interesting. And I mean, it seems to me that that is the sort of thing that is actually a little bit more in the vein of the things that, or some of what Sinan and Francis were talking about, or that I've been thinking about for a long time, where there it's not so much like this chain up of random person takes a picture, elite shares it, social media, like mainstream media picks it up, everybody hears about it, but it is this kind of more or less organic propagation through different communities, who, at least once it gets out into the, into the other category where you're maybe most worried about it, the people that are seeing it there are people that aren't sort of directly invested in misinformation or in whatever, sort of niche element it is. And so it's, it seems plausible to me that that's a kind of context where getting people to basically stop and slow down and think about, whether this is misleading or not before they share it, or trying to identify content reasonably quickly. If they say this is bad content, platforms should put the brakes on it, might actually be more helpful in that sort of dynamic.
David, if I could,
yeah, please.
If I could just jump in here, I think that a really important aspect to keep in mind about all of this, and particularly in the ways that academic research proceeds, is to think about how each of those social media groups, particularly on Facebook, are pushed and advanced and furthered by national organizations that have a specific and direct interest in spreading disinformation. So, according to the CDC, Massachusetts has the lowest statewide vaccine hesitancy rate in the country, but local vaccine opponents are directly supported by national vaccine opposition organizations. And they remain this very vocal minority, and they propagate in multiple different ways, specifically on Facebook, using Facebook group names that are, generally speaking, much of the same people, forming multiple different groups with names that sound appealing to people in this, in the other category that Renee described, right? Health Choice Massachusetts. In general, that might sound like a fairly innocuous name, but that's actually a Massachusetts affiliate of American Citizens for Health Choice, a Minnesota-based nonprofit organization supporting anti-science activism in more than 20 states, right? That's nearly half the nation. The Massachusetts medical advisors, so-called medical advisors, include a chiropractor and a naturopath, all of whom are talking about vaccines. Right to an Education Massachusetts is a campaign actually led by American Citizens for Health Choice, again, the same organization, and the Canary Party, a political party working toward a vaccine-free nation. That is their own words, right? And local groups continue to give platforms to Robert Kennedy Jr., Shiva Ayyadurai, who is a Massachusetts resident and known vaccine refuser and mouthpiece for the anti-vax movement, and other prominent vaccine opponents, to increase vaccine resistance and hesitancy throughout not just Massachusetts, but elsewhere. And then they form local groups, Health Choice Massachusetts, insert the name of a town, Health Choice Massachusetts, insert the name of a city. And they propagate in multiple different ways to try to get as many people as they possibly can, and then spread disinformation that way. And there are honestly more Facebook groups than any. It's like, I hate to use the phrase whack-a-mole, but it's like whack-a-mole trying to keep up with the number of different Facebook groups that pop up all the time. It's not just on Facebook. It's not just on Twitter. It's everywhere. But a lot of the spread, particularly the spread that Renee was describing a few moments ago, does happen through Facebook, through groups that are specifically titled to engage people in a way that makes them confused about the fact or unaware of the fact that they are in fact being exposed to stark vaccine disinformation. and and then it continues to propagate throughout the state, and and that is massively problematic in many different ways, not the least of which is the real life consequences of what happens when we fail to achieve herd immunity against a vaccine preventable illness, right? We are in Massachusetts, we are actually lacking herd immunity in multiple localities, municipalities across the state, based on a reduction in the number of young people who are getting, or whose parents are providing for them, access to routine childhood vaccinations. And that is continuing to happen. Plus the fact that we had a lot of people whose pediatric appointment schedules were pretty significantly interrupted by the onset of COVID-19. So we do see the extension of social media, disinformation, propagation, and propaganda into very real life consequences. And it's not just about schools, it's not just about families, it's also about businesses and local economies. And it feeds into this local, state level, and national conversation that centers on QAnon and anti-CRT, anti-Semitism, anti-government, anti-choice, anti-DEI propaganda.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and so I think that one element of this that makes me think about is there is all this focus on Facebook and Twitter, and as we said before, a big problem with Facebook is it's largely a walled garden. Like with CrowdTangle, you can see public posts, but you don't really have a great sense of what's going on. But I think that some of these other groups like Nextdoor, where there are these community groups, there's some wild stuff on our Cambridge Nextdoor, and I can only imagine what is out there more generally. And something that I think is a really important aspect of social media relative to traditional media that is understudied because it's hard to study in a compelling way is the effect of the social proof element of it. That is the fact that you get to see lots of people have liked this. Like in the world, if I see, 40,000 people liked this, I'm like, oh, well, I should probably, like that carries weight. But then also seeing that people that specifically shared it could really change the way people interact with that content. And I think that that's one of the particularly important things to study that requires some ingenuity to figure out how to do it in a compelling way. And that could be part of why some of these things seem to be very effective coming through these channels. Duncan?
Thanks, David. That's a really gripping example there, and super concerning. And obviously, seeing a rise in vaccine hesitancy is something that should terrify all of us. I just wanted to sort of try again to broaden the context a little bit here. Kevin Munger, who's a political scientist at Penn State University, has a really interesting essay recently where it's titled "Facebook is Other People," and the gist of the essay is, we go and look at a social media platform, and we see bad things, right? And we see people doing bad things, and we think, oh, this is a problem with social media, right? This is like somehow it's the design of the site, it's the algorithms, that's like causing this phenomenon. But to some extent, it's just that we're actually seeing what people are like. I used to, in the early days of Twitter, I used to, joke that, imagine we had this magical device that could allow us to listen in on everything that everybody was saying in the world. What would they be talking about, right? What would they be saying to each other? What would they be screaming at their television screens or at their computer screens? And now we have that magical device, and we get to see what people are saying, and a lot of it's terrible. And so some of that is because that's what people are like, right? It's shocking to be confronted with that, but it's not necessarily a property of the social media platform. so much as a property of the people who are just using it to do the thing that they were doing before, right? The second point is that—
Well, just to interject on that, I think that is it's a critical question that I think we don't really know the answer to that well. And I think that your point, which I think is a good one, is I think people just assume that it is the platform doing, like, adding some bad energy to that, essentially.
Which could be true.
Right, but we don't know.
And I'll get to that in a second. But the other point that I think is worth keeping in mind is that some of these properties that we worry about on social media are actually really a property of the web, the internet, right? That, you know, one of the you know, if you go back and read sort of some of the early, you know, web evangelists in the late 90s, like, the whole point of the web was to, like, reduce the transaction costs, to make it easier for people to talk to each other. It was precisely to let small groups of people who might otherwise not have someone to talk to about this particular thing that they were interested in connect, right? That there was this, and that actually has produced enormous social value, right? That there are lots and lots, you know, millions, billions of people in the world who are sort of interested in quirky things. And if they were just forced to interact with you know, the people in their immediate physical vicinity, they would have zero people to talk to about those things. And by the way, this also applies to people who are sort of suffering from chronic illnesses. That the web opened up an entire world of possibility. And, you know, for every sort of extremist group on Facebook, there's probably 100 or 1,000 other groups of people who are, you know, talking about cargo bikes or gardening or, you know, any other sort of random thing. So, so I think probably in general, this is a good thing, right? This is like something that the web did that produced tremendous value. And we see that reflected in social media companies as well. And so it's like really tricky to sort of start, you know, attributing causality and, you know, and sort of, you know, talking about how we should, you know, turn things off, you know, in part because, you know, we are just sort of seeing, you know, human behavior being revealed in a way that wasn't obvious to us before. And in part because we kind of like, you know, we've sort of passed through the looking glass, you know, we can't sort of go back to a world where we don't have the technology to communicate in this way. And so some of this is you know, that there are, you know, pros and cons to allowing people to talk to each other easily. And it's not at all clear that you can say, well, you guys can talk to each other about cargo bikes, but you can't talk to each other about, you know, your feelings over vaccines. So it's a, you know, I don't deny that it's a terrible problem, but I feel very conflicted about, you know, how we think about solutions.
Great. Renee, I think you had a response.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is that yes, it is other people. Yes, you know, it is largely been a wonderful thing, you know, to bring communities of people together. But I think that you know, there's a phrase, we shape our systems, thereafter they shape us, right? And one of the things that we see is the extent to which the network is shaped by the platform for the incentives of the platform. I think in his book, Sinan refers to this perhaps as closing triangles. I hope I'm not misattributing that, but the idea that you two know each other, ergo you should know this, you know, this third person, the idea that we're just kind of constantly creating denser and denser networks, or even the way in which a lot of the more malign communities grew was through the recommendation engine. You mentioned vaccines. You know, when I was a mom in 2013, I started getting a lot of pushes to join anti-vaccine groups. Now, I had not indicated any interest whatsoever in anti-vaccine activism. I was just a new mom. Statistically speaking, it made sense for the recommendation engine to push that to me. When I did, in fact, join one, I wanted to see what was going on in there. I began getting recommended Pizzagate content, then QAnon content. I did not ever type these things into the search bar. This was not a deep interest that I had that I wanted to find people to connect with. This was an interest that was pushed to me. And that's where I think on the responsibility front, it's this question of what is the role that the system plays in shaping the network? Because right now, I think that we have some debt that we've accrued from really misguided curation and recommendations that began in the early, you know, 2013, 2014 timeframe that did eventually lead to the creation of massive movements like QAnon that are fundamentally antisocial and destructive. That we're not, there is nothing positive, I would argue, about pushing people into conspiratorial cults, and yet that is what was happening. And subsequently to January 6th, you saw the platforms try to take down those networks, right? You saw Twitter take down about 30,000 accounts. But the problem is, as you note, once those connections have been established, they do migrate. And so that community is simply active on Telegram now, right? And that's I think, one of the things that we have to reckon with as we think about envisioning the system going forward is, in fact, the role that design plays in creating the networks, the way that the information then moves along it. And have we designed this system in any kind of optimal, intentional way? Recognizing that you don't want to be doing like viewpoint-based discrimination around particular topics, but there has to be something, I think, more strategic than just, well, you're statistically similar to these people, so let me push this group at you.
Senator Rash, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I want to just both uplift the comments that Renee just made. I became a mom in 2014, so we're in the same bucket here. You know, this is, I think, a really critical nexus between big tech and the law, right? You know, the algorithms that pushed that content to Renee and droves of others of us who also became parents, who never expressed any interest whatsoever in anti-vax propaganda or anti-CRT propaganda or QAnon propaganda or any of the rest of the disinformation that's flying around out there. Those algorithms promote it and send it right to people. And that promotion of fringe content yields radicalization, as we're hearing through multiple conversations today, and multiple conversations beyond today. So, you know, where does the law intersect? The First Amendment is deeply important. It is also not without its limits, right? You cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. So in a lot of ways, you know, I think our legal system hasn't yet caught up to this particular advent of speech. And that is a really complicated, I'm not a legal scholar in the area of First Amendment law, but I think this is an area where we need folks such as yourselves, doing research on the technology, on the algorithms, on data collection regulation, on regulation generally of big tech, to get with the legal scholars who are working in tangential, related areas, particularly around the First Amendment, to figure out what should be done, right? What should we be changing, if anything, in the legal scheme at the federal level or at the state level or even at the local level? The local level is a little more challenging, particularly when it comes to social media. And these are deeply important questions, but as it stands right now, as a government official, we can't touch comments on social media, right? Anything that is disinformation that people lob into our, comments on posts we put up on social media, and we could put up a picture of a rock and it would still become inflamed and incendiary because of the leadership that I have provided with regard to vaccines and immunization infrastructure. And by the way, that includes even infrastructure that has no bearing whatsoever on whether vaccines are mandated, right? This is just about improvements to public health immunization infrastructure, about data collection, for example, and standardizing and centralizing vaccine requirements and that already exist, and making sure that we have accurate and complete data on vaccine exemptions, which is also part of the legal landscape in Massachusetts, at least, and most other states in the nation. And I just want to address that comment from the audience about the phrase vaccine hesitancy. The question says, vaccine hesitancy is a label that seems designed to give less offense to people who might be on the fence about vaccines. And I want to be very clear and honest and forthcoming about the fact that there is racism. We are a nation that continues to grapple with hundreds of years of systemic racism, and that has manifested in the medical community. And so there is some hesitancy around that, and we should be working hard. And I have led with several of my colleagues, at least in the Massachusetts frame to generate equity and provide accurate information, specifically to address the kind of hesitancy that comes from that. That is notably distinct from anti-vax propaganda, the anti-vax movement, and straight out vaccine refusal that is based on gross disinformation. So I wanted to just uplift that question from our audience and provide a little bit of context.
Great, thanks. And so I think that this is actually a good place so we have about 5 minutes left, and the next panel moderated by Dean Eccles is actually about algorithms and algorithmic transparency. And I feel like that's sort of where this conversation wound up, where I think that this is, to me, the big question. Is how much of the bad stuff that we're seeing on social media is, well, Facebook is other people and other people are just terrible. Or there's lots of people saying things you wouldn't want to hear, and normally you didn't hear it and now you hear it. Sort of the position Duncan was representing, versus how much of it is the recommendation algorithms bringing content to people that they otherwise wouldn't see, which is the position that Renee and to some extent Senator Roush were representing. And so I think that this is, from an empirical perspective, so there are clear anecdotal examples of recommendation things happening. That is of these, of recommendation algorithms bringing content that is not good to people. But I think there's actually, it's really hard to get good large scale empirical data on how much is the recommendations and how much is just what the people want. And I think that is like a really key place for future work on this. And I guess the one other thing that I would say in that vein is a lot of the work on recommendations or on algorithms that I've seen is in terms of the news feed, like what content is being up or down ranked. But the whole recommendations of who to follow or what pages to follow are like a whole different thing that I think, at least in is getting a lot less attention, but seems super important, and much more important that if you get suggested to join a group, then you're getting bombarded by all the stuff that comes out of the group. And that seems like a really important area for this. So, okay, so we got 3 minutes left. Duncan had a hand up, Renee had a hand up. So let's do quick final comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to I agree with Renee's point earlier that the initial design of these platforms was not thoughtful, right? And I will sort of take some credit for having been a critic of Facebook long before it was fashionable to be a critic of Facebook back in as early as 2006. It made no sense to me that you would just connect everybody and show all the same stuff to the same, to the entirety of your social network. That just seemed totally antithetical to the idea of social networks. And so I always found that, some of the design choices to be puzzling and clearly, optimized for engagement, not for like actual meaningful social connection. That said, I think the causal attribution question is just really, really tricky, right? And that's what David was just saying, I think. So, one way that we think about it is, people, platforms recommend things, but in the end, what matters is what people consume. And when we look at consumption, I can't speak for Facebook because we don't have that data, but for YouTube, where people say exactly the same things about radicalization, we really don't see evidence of that, right? That people sort of come to YouTube and they continue to watch the stuff that they want to watch. And there's relatively little impact that we can detect from algorithms. So maybe they're getting recommended stuff, but it doesn't seem to be affecting their consumption. And so that kind of approach to Facebook would be super interesting to take.
Agreed. And we have a paper that shows that taking out the recommendation element and just showing, if you follow people with partisan accounts, they are 3 times more likely to follow back co-partisans compared to counterpartisans. So even absent any algorithmic element, there clearly is a baseline preference issue also. And the question is, to what extent are algorithms amping that up extra? So Renee, you want the last word?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we talk about it in the context of algorithms, affordances, and agency, right? The sort of 3 A's as we try to delineate what is happening within the system. But I will just say, to bring it back around to the very first point you made, something like the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act or some of the legislation that's beginning to move through Congress, it's very boring. Everybody wants to fight about CDA 230, but something really boring like transparency is so foundational to being able to address these questions empirically going forward. And I really hope that that we see something come out of Congress on that front.
Completely agree. I think that that will be a recurring theme through some of the other panels as well. And so, yeah, we've now reached the end of our time. Thank you all so much for joining me. I thought this was a really interesting and insightful conversation. Thank you so much for all these different perspectives. Thanks everyone for joining us. And now we'll be on to the next panel about algorithmic transparency.